I'm Ben Friedman. I'm a PhD student in political science here at MIT and an affiliate of the Security Studies program. I'm also a research fellow in Defense and Homeland Security Studies at the Cato Institute. What I want to do today is explain why the defense budget is so big. The conventional wisdom I'm going to dispute is that the defense budget is a rational response to threats and uncertainty in the international arena, that it's basically the right size given the dangers we in the United States face. I consider that to be the conventional wisdom because the defense budget passes the Congress each year with minimal controversy about its size. The disputes tend to be on the margins about what we buy, but not about the amount of money we spend. The fiscal year 2011 defense budget that the Obama administration submitted to Congress recently is the biggest defense budget in the United States since World War II. The number usually cited as the base or non-war budget is $549 billion. That's 3.4% more than last year and 1.8% adjusting for inflation. But that's just the largest chunk of non-war defense spending. To get total spending, you have to add $4 billion in mandatory defense spending and another $27 billion for nukes and other defense activities, mostly in the Department of Energy. That gives us about $580 billion, which is 50% higher in real terms, adjusting for inflation, than the 1998 defense budget, which is when this ongoing military buildup began. To get real defense spending, though, we still have to add the war costs, which is about $159 billion. That's the amount the Obama administration just asked Congress for. And it's possible they might come back at the end of the year and ask for even more money. So if you add that, you get about $739 billion. That's total defense spending. In real terms, that's 16% higher than the Cold War peak, which occurred during the Korean War. That's more than the rest of the world spends combined on defense, and it's 6 times more roughly than what China spends. And to that, if you were being a nitpicker, you could reasonably add another $180 billion from veterans, Homeland Security, and Treasury that could reasonably be considered defense spending, plus another $60 billion as defense's portion of payments on the national debt. So by a more generous accounting, we're spending almost $1 trillion on defense this year in the United States, next year, fiscal year 2011. So why do we spend so much? Well, as I said, conventional wisdom says, look, we're fighting 2 wars. We're fighting a war on terror, and we face a lot of other threats that require our defenses. That is, the world's a dangerous place, and it requires a great deal of caution, and that caution is manifest in military spending. Well, obviously, I don't agree with that, so let me say why. Let's start with the wars. They're only about 20% of the total defense spending, and so we have this other 80% that we need to account for, and that's been growing plenty over the last decade. So what about the idea that we're just balancing against threats that are out there? Now, obviously, I can't debunk thoroughly the idea in a few minutes that we're just balancing against all the threats that are out there for us, but I'll just make a few points to that end. With nuclear weapons and favorable geography, the United States would be quite safe with minimal spending, far less spending, and a restrained military posture. Invasion and civil war, which are the troubles that traditionally justified militaries, are unthinkable in the United States. Most of the dangers we face become because we inject ourselves into foreign trouble, and they're actually avoidable. But we've been taught otherwise in the United States. We've been told that a variety of serious threats menace our shores, and that our security requirements are now so broad that they're practically synonymous with the success of liberal government and political stability in most corners of the world. So the specific threats that we're supposed to face are rogue states, potential great powers, and terrorists. So let me say a couple words about each of them in turn. The remaining rogue states, so to speak, are North Korea, Iran, and maybe Syria. They collectively spend about 1/60th of what we in the United States do on defense. None are physically capable of attacking the United States, except maybe North Korea with no-dong missiles that could reach Hawaii. None now even has the military capability to conquer neighboring states. None is crazy enough, I argue, to attack the United States. Iran's leaders are awful, but evidently not suicidal. Since the Iranian Revolution, internationally, they behave like other states, which is not to say they behave well, but they're not outside the norm of what we see if we look at history, if we look at China after their revolution or the Soviet Union in its early days. The next menace that we're told justifies our defense budget are great powers, or as they're called in defense jargon, peer competitors, potential peer competitors. That means China and Russia, but they're actually far from being our peers. China is today really no match for our military. Its investments on its military go towards territorial defense, starting with its army, the PLA. It's true that its wealth creation has allowed it to spend far more on everything, including defense. So China may be able to challenge, the American military decades down the line if the economic troubles it's having, along with other countries, and demand for social spending don't derail it. But there are several reasons why that possibility down the road shouldn't justify high military spending for the United States today. Even if China becomes a great military power, we have little reason for a dangerous rivalry with it, akin to the Cold War, because, first of all, we have no big territorial dispute with it. The Cold War, in large parts, was about Western Europe. It was largely about how Germany was going to, the political path Germany would take. We have no like dispute with China today, other than Taiwan, which I argue is a problem only insofar as we claim to defend it. We no longer have an ideological conflict with China or Russia. Both retain pretty odious political systems, but they no longer defend themselves intellectually. They're out of the revolution export business. As for Russia, whether or not it wants its empire back, it lacks the capability to get it. Its gross domestic product is now, the last time I checked, it was around the size of Portugal and Italy's combined. It has plenty of nukes, but those are not very useful for offensive military adventures. They're good for deterrent, for defense. And Russia is really a second-rate military power now that poses little threat to the European Union, which now has a collective GDP bigger than that of the United States. And therefore, the EU has the capability to defend itself. Russia may be a threat to its near abroad, to Georgia and Ukraine, but that shouldn't justify U.S. defenses of those countries. While we might sympathize with them, the costs of defending them, I think, badly outweigh the benefits of doing so. What about al-Qaeda terrorists? Well, I believe that their capability to harm us has been massively overrated in the media and in most commentary in the United States. I think they're less like the global supervillains they're normally portrayed as than like 19th century anarchists or early 20th century anarchists, transnational troublemakers who can cause a lot of harm and problems, but I think al-Qaeda is likely to flame out in similar fashion over the next decade or two because their ideology is so noxious and violent. And it's not surprisingly, it's been losing popularity across the Muslim world for the last couple years, in spite of our wars in the United States that we've prosecuted in the last few years, which seem to support, I think, the propaganda point, the terrorist propaganda point that the United States is at war with Islam. But even if you disagree with me that terrorists are overrated, it's not obvious that terrorism is principally a military problem as opposed to one handled best by intelligence and policing. Of course, our conventional force structure, our military forces are going to be needed extensively for counterterrorism if you believe, with most of the U.S. national security establishment, that counterterrorism requires counterinsurgency. The idea here is that to be safe from terrorism, we need to fight a series of counterinsurgency campaigns, or at least assist in them, to stabilize failed states, lest terrorists gain haven there. The trouble with this view is that, as we've demonstrated, I think, in the last few years or the last decade in the United States, fixing failed states with military forces is an outrageously expensive proposition in every sense, and one likely to fail regardless of our effort. Moreover, the theoretical link between failed states and terrorism is actually quite weak. I think Afghanistan and Yemen are sort of exceptional. In most cases, failed states produce a lot of internal violence and misery, but little really relevant to U.S. national security unless we get involved. So I think we can stay out. As political scientists like Robert Pape argue, evidence suggests that failed states, trying to fix failed states with occupational military forces makes the occupier a target of terrorism rather than preventing terrorism against the occupier. Another sort of more academic argument for our military size is that we should provide security for the whole world, shielding states from geopolitical competition, which is said to hurt us in the United States. either by causing those nations to arm more heavily, growing into rivals that challenge our power, or causing wars between those states that potentially mess up trade and hurt us economically. This is the strategy of primacy or hegemony, and it's accomplished theoretically by having a large military which is deployed globally, and it's accomplished by a string of military alliances around the world. And to me, this both overestimates our ability to stabilize the world and the trouble that results if instability does occur. In most cases, especially in the Middle East, or at least in many cases, our military is either useless in the face of instability or provocative enough to cause it because of nationalism. And I think in Europe, for a whole host of reasons, the states there are likely to remain peaceful. Europe's likely to remain stable without our troops there for the foreseeable future. Asia, I think, is a little bit more complicated. I think pulling our troops from Japan would cause Japan to militarize more, maybe spend a little bit more on its more than 1% and a little bit more than it now spends on defense, and that could cause some added spending in China. It might even cause Japan to develop nuclear weapons. But I don't think there's good reason to assume that that would cause a war between those states rather than a stable balance of power. Now, we sometimes hear that U.S. military hegemony is needed because globalization has increased our dependence on overseas suppliers. But actually, the knitting together of markets, which we refer to as globalization, actually lessens the need for global military forces or global military deployments because it increases supply options. So trouble in one spot that threatens a producer of some good that we consume or some component that we need in something we consume simply allows another producer to step in, and consumers barely notice the disruption. This is importantly true of oil. Because oil is a global commodity, disruptions in one location tend to cause market adjustments elsewhere. And that lessens the need to prevent disruptions downstream with troop deployments. And so that basically undermines the whole theory of U.S. military deployments to the Middle East, which are justified to keep oil cheap. The primacy or hegemony view also ignores the fact that our dominance produces rivals and draws us into potential conflicts. Our military posture in Asia may drive China to increase its military spending, and it causes smaller states that have bad relations with us, like North Korea, to develop nuclear weapons, which obviously is the cause of our proliferation concerns. There's other reasons North Korea develops nuclear weapons, largely having to do with South Korea, but I think we're one cause of it. Our presence is one cause of their desire to protect themselves that way. Supremacists also ignore the trouble that our alliances cause us. We formed our Cold War alliances at the start of the Cold War because of a concern about the balance of power. Now, that condition disappeared long ago. It disappeared far before the Cold War ended. But now our alliances have become something different. They become sort of perpetual security subsidies, and I think they become actually worse than useless. They waste our money by heightening our defense commitments. We have to spend all this money based on this proposition that we might defend the Western Europeans or the Japanese or the South Koreans, and they drive up our force structure requirements. And they also threaten to drag us into wars that need not involve us. So the New Deal with our alliances is that we agree to defend our allies and they agree to let us. So I think all our allies in South Korea, in Europe, in Japan now have the capability, the wherewithal, the economic wealth to protect themselves, and we should let them. And I think our relations with them will be fine without military alliances. We don't need military alliances to have good relations with Japan or Germany. Trade and diplomacy will be sufficient. I'm going to just mention three sort of wonky kinds of reasons why our defense budget has grown so much of late, which are sort of decisions about the allocation of our defense resources that have maybe unintentionally caused pressure for cost growth in the Pentagon. The first one of those three is increased pay and benefits. Compensation per service member has almost doubled in the last decade as a result of legislation and the political climate it reflects, which is who's going to vote against a pay increase for soldiers in the middle of a war. These people are risking their lives and they deserve to be well compensated. And you can't argue with that. Healthcare costs of service members and their dependents have also grown rapidly of late, faster even than in the rest of the economy as a result, again, of the provision of greater benefits. That's true for people in service and for retirees. DoD's healthcare costs have grown from $20 billion in 1998 to $47 billion in 2010. So we're seeing increased costs of manpower in the Pentagon. And these added costs have squeezed the money needed for new weapons. And that causes advocates of procurement in the military services and the congressional districts around the country where weapons are made to push for higher top lines in the defense budget because they know personnel is untouchable. So to grow their slice of the pie, the part of the pie that they're concerned about, they know they have to grow the whole pie. The second reason for cost growth within the Pentagon is the growth and complexity of weapon systems. Ships, aircraft, even things like radios and trucks have gotten more complex. For example, the unit flyaway cost, the total cost for one F-35 fighter jet, which is the fighter that we're now procuring, is about $90 million. That's about 3 times the cost in real terms, adjusting for inflation, of the F-16, the fighter that it's mostly replacing. The third reason for cost growth within the Pentagon is the absence of real trade-offs or choices among defense means. The Secretary of Defense talks a lot about the trade-offs that he's forced on the services, on the military, to make it focus more on winning the sorts of wars we're in, on the counterinsurgency campaigns we're fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan and wars like them. But the budget that he sends to Congress shows only limited sacrifice to this purpose. We're still spending a ton of money on the big wars that he claims we're sacrificing to get better at counterinsurgency. Now, to be fair to the Secretary, his ability to make hard choices is limited. The budget is really made by the services, along with the 4 defense committees in Congress, the appropriators and authorizers in both houses. And real reduction in any area of the budget, from the Secretary's perspective, requires a big fight with some of those people. A brawl, really, with one service or a part of it and a chunk of Congress. And we have seen some money move into areas designed for counterinsurgency campaigns, ground forces, helicopters, UAVs, intelligence, special operations, and the like. But these changes seem to have come not at the expense of other capabilities, but by adding money to the overall pot. So today, instead of hard choices, we have a defense budget that seems to be a bit of everything. And this is clear even from the sort of vacuous strategy documents that are supposed to explain our defense budget, like the recently released Quadrennial Defense Review. We have a defense budget that tries to do everything. I think our defense planners suffer from what I would call strategic incontinence. They envision the U.S. military as a tool to contain China, transform failed states so they resemble ours, chase terrorists, keep oil cheap, democratize the Middle East, protect European, Asian, and Middle Eastern countries from the geopolitical competition that would cause them to develop military power independent of ours, popularize the United States via humanitarian missions, respond to natural disasters abroad and at home, secure the seas, space, and the internet, and now even do something about global warming. Now, the forces needed to accomplish this litany of aspirations can never be enough. So we need more of everything and higher defense spending. So that lack of trade-offs is a cause of higher defense spending. And the last part of my talk is address why we're not forced to make more trade-offs. Why do these ideas about all the things that our military does, which I've said don't really make sense, why do these ideas succeed? Why do they go largely unchallenged in the United States? Now, my view is that the United States has become more militaristic in the last several decades, maybe even the last century, because we had the opportunity, because of our relative power, to develop global defense commitments, and that caused us to institutionalize interests that benefit from teaching the public, the U.S. public, these ideas, this kind of ideology that justifies a big defense budget. The political scientist Robert Dahl said that the difference between a dictatorship and a democracy is that in a dictatorship, a minority rules, and in a democracy, minorities rule. Which is to say that what governs outcome in democratic politics is less the public interest than the relative strength of particular interests. So there's this sort of tyranny of the status quo, where institutions that began in response to external conditions survive once these conditions disappear because they've generated interests that sell ideas to protect themselves. And I think defense politics is particularly prone to this problem because the entities that benefit from the provision of defense are also where we get our ideas about defense. They teach us about our security and what it requires. And I think this situation results from international and domestic factors. We have so much relative power in the United States because of our wealth and so great a margin of safety because of geography that we can have an ideological or luxury foreign policy. But politicians who embrace this sort of mission tend to justify it not only as an ideological crusade but as a security requirement. because that sells better. So you tell people that they're directly threatened in order to justify a policy that you maybe support primarily for ideological reasons. Iraq is an example. The Bush administration sold it not just as something that we should do because it would help spread liberal values, but as a direct security requirement for the United States. And that bait and switch, which happens, I argue, all the time in U.S. foreign policy, helps perpetuate the idea that there are many great threats to the United States. Also, the Cold War left us with a large set of interests or institutions that benefit from high defense spending. Those concentrated interests are the military services, which help us interpret threats and have great credibility in the public opinion, and the contractors, in particular their employees and their congressional representatives who tend to go to the congressional committees that make decisions about our defense budget. Because it serves them electorally to extract jobs. So that's sort of this military-industrial complex idea, which is not a conspiracy, but just a set of interests that benefit from high defense spending. Then you have the two-party system, which reflects this set of ideas about military spending because the median voter, who they have to appeal to, has sort of learned these ideas over time. So we're left in the United States without a dovish party. The two parties sort of compete to be hawkish. And politicians seeking national office tend to reflect, particularly politicians who are running for president or trying to be prominent nationally, reflect these party lines, as do analysts, which is very important because analysts hope to work, many analysts in Washington, D.C. hope to work for a president or something like that, so they have to sort of reflect the party lines. If the parties are overly hawkish, so are ambitious analysts. I'm not saying that people are lying about threats or that they're in some sort of conspiracy to trick us. I'm just saying through the pursuit of their own parochial interests, military organizations and those who benefit from their spending, just by pointing out the threats we face rather than their probability, produce a somewhat cacophonous but still loud chorus that convinces us, the American public, that threats are great and that the national interest requires great defense spending, heavy defense spending. And on the other side, the people who have an interest in restraining defense spending, there really is no other side, as former Secretary of Defense Les Aspin once said. The strong interests hurt by high military spending are few. And that's caused, I think, by the end of the draft, which was a good thing. I don't think we should have a draft. But it prevents people from having a really strong personal interest in saying we should spend less on defense. Another force preventing the formation of competing interests is deficit spending, which prevents competition among priorities within the government. And so you don't have people who want to spend more on health care necessarily saying, well, we need to spend less on defense, and therefore going after the arguments that justify defense spending in order to free up money for health care. So without competing interests, you get no real marketplace of ideas, to use the famous John Stuart Mill phrase, and bad ideas survive, and I think one of those that survives is all these ideas that justify our high defense spending. So I think that's how you get a policy that sort of, to me, is irrational.